Bom dia a todos. Vamos continuar essa excelente programação do 5º Simpósio Internacional de Tratamento Mínimo e Imagem da Mama, nosso querido Breastmit, é um evento já consagrado no nosso país e no mundo, né? Nós estamos com mais de 30 países diferentes assistindo, mais de 1.000 pessoas acessando esse evento. E essa nossa mesa, a gente vai falar da personalização, né, da imagem mamária além da mamografia. Nós vamos contar com 2 palestrantes internacionais que são de altíssimo nível, a professora Fiona Gilbert, que é professora chefe do Departamento de Radiologia da Universidade de Cambridge, e ela estuda muito novas tecnologias ligadas à doença mamária. E a professora Fiona vai falar para a gente sobre o papel da mamografia contrastada ou da ressonância magnética abreviada em mamas densas, o estudo BRIND. A segunda aula será da professora Sara Savaridas. A professora Sara Savaridas, ela é professora sênior da Universidade de Dundee, ela é diretora do Serviço de Rastreamento do Câncer de Mama do Leste da Escócia e também uma pesquisadora na área de novas tecnologias, principalmente de mamografia contrastada. A professora Sara vai falar para a gente sobre a custo-efetividade da mamografia contrastada, comparado com a ressonância magnética para o estadiamento local do câncer de mama. A seguir, nós teremos as discussões e eu apresentarei os demais membros da mesa. Vamos dar prosseguimento à nossa programação.
So I'm here today to talk about the role of contrast-enhanced mammography, or CEM as it's known, or abbreviated breast MRI, abMRI, in dense breasts. And I'm going to talk to you about the BRAID trial. But unfortunately, I'm not able to share many of the results of the trial as yet. So anyone who's working in breast imaging and breast screening understands that overdiagnosis is a recognized problem. It's calculated that about 20% of screen-detected cancers from the published trial data are thought to be overdiagnoses. And overdiagnosis means a cancer that is diagnosed by a screening examination that would not have been found otherwise. In the UK, we have a 3-yearly screening programme compared to 2-yearly across Europe or annual in for some women in America. And in the UK, because we screen less, our overdiagnosis is estimated to be about 3.7%. Now, I think actually a larger problem that we've got is underdiagnosis. And it's certainly, I think, one of the main issues that we've got in the UK screening programme. By underdiagnosis, I mean that we're not picking up cancers that we should be finding. And this is due to 2 main things. It's due to our 3-yearly interval between examinations, and also it's due to the fact that women have got very dense breast tissue, and this is problematic. Now, cancers that occur between the screens are called interval cancers, in the interval between the screening. And so it's the interval cancers, some of these interval cancers are really what we mean by the underdiagnosis. Now, why are interval cancers a problem? Why is this underdiagnosis a problem? Well, it means that the underdiagnosed cancers tend to be larger when they do present symptomatically, and they often are a higher grade of cancer. They tend to be more aggressive. And there's been some nice publications which show that, in fact, breast cancer survival, this is from a German study, breast cancer survival is much worse if you present with your symptoms, if you present with a lump in your breast or changes in the breast tissue. The prognosis for that cancer is much worse compared to those cancers that are picked up by screening or early detection. Now, even people say, oh, it's because you're finding these cancers earlier, a lead time bias. But even if we adjust for lead time bias, the cancers that occur between the screening intervals have a worse outlook. More women die of them compared to those women who have cancers diagnosed by the screening program. So what is it we're talking about here? Well, there's different grades of density. By density, on a mammogram, we talk about the amount of whiteness on the examination. And here you can see from left to right, you can see increasing breast density. And these would be termed BI-RADS A, B, C, and D, according to the BI-RADS 5th edition. Now, the problem that we've got is that in those people with a dense breast tissue, they have more cancers, and their small cancers get hidden behind the dense breast tissue. So we don't find them, or we find the cancers when they're larger, which means the women have a poorer prognosis. So what should we be doing about this? Well, the first thing that we did in Cambridge in the UK was try and estimate the extent of interval cancers and underdiagnosis. So we took a 3-yearly screening cohort of almost 50,000 people, and we followed them up for 5 years. We had over 400 screen-detected cancers and over 200 interval cancers. And then we recorded the raw data, and so we were able to use the Volpara density score to put the women into the 4 density categories. So about 9.7% of the population have the BI-RADS D category. And in fact, you can see that there's large numbers of cancers in this group. So we find about 8 cancers per 1,000. And you kind of go, well, what's the problem? You know, compared with BI-RADS A with a fatty breast, it's only 5.5 per 1,000. But in fact, the problem is that we've got large numbers of interval cancers in this group. So overall, in the BI-RADS D category, we've got 16 per 1,000, BI-RADS C 13.6 per 1,000, BI-RADS B 12.7 per 1,000, and BI-RADS A 8 per 1,000. And you think, well, that's very respectable. But the problem here is that, in fact, the mammograms are not picking up all the cancers. In the BI-RADS D category, only 50% of the cancers are being picked up by the breast mammogram. So what should we be doing about this? This is one of the big motivations for the BRAID study. So we should look at breast tomosynthesis, we should look at whole breast ultrasound, contrast mammography, and abbreviated MRI, abbreviated being the very fast version, a less expensive version of magnetic resonance imaging. So tomosynthesis is where you take multiple views through the breast tissue, and then this produces between 30 and 60 slices through the breast tissue, so you can begin to see what's going on in amongst the dense breast tissue. And it is particularly helpful for women who've got BI-RADS B, C, and D, but doesn't find more cancers in BI-RADS A. So in the UK, we're running the Prospect study. We've recruited over 61,000 people into this study, and we'll be looking at the number of cancers that we're picking up according to breast density and the size and type of cancers. But in fact, if we look at the other studies, the big German trial, the TESIMA trial, where they compared DBT with 2D examinations, you can see that DBT is picking up far more cancers in the BI-RADS D category, 8 per 1,000 compared to 2.3 per 1,000, BI-RADS C 8 per 1,000 compared to 6 per 1,000, and even in BI-RADS B 7 per 1,000 compared to 4 per 1,000. Same numbers in BI-RADS A group. So this looks very encouraging. So probably DBT should be part of the tools that we could be considering for women with increased breast density. However, not all the trials have found this, and certainly this Norwegian study, the DB study, found no difference in the cancer detection rate between arms after they randomized women. But it was a smaller study, and they have not split it up by breast density. So what about the BRAID trial? So the BRAID trial is basically looking to see whether we should be offering supplemental imaging to women after 2 people have read their mammogram, their X-ray, their breast X-ray, to see whether we can pick up these additional breast cancers before they appear as interval cancers or even cancers in the next round of imaging. Now, you could say many countries, particularly in America and in some countries in Europe, are already offering ultrasound as a supplemental imaging tool. And in fact, in America, it's now mandatory that women are told their breast density, and then they can ask for additional imaging. It's certainly not always reimbursed by the American system. But the question we're trying to answer in the BRAID trial is, Which of the supplemental imaging tests is best? We know that magnetic resonance imaging is extremely sensitive for picking up breast cancer, particularly in younger women. This is why we use MRI for the BRCA carriers and those at 50% risk of being a BRCA carrier. We offer them MRI because of the high sensitivity of MRI in those younger women with increased breast density. But what we don't know is whether abbreviated MRI is better than contrast mammography or whole breast ultrasound. So this is the question that the BRAID trial is posing. So what we propose to do is compare these imaging techniques by randomizing over 8,500 women who were attending the UK screening programme, that's women between the ages of 50 and 70, who have dense breast tissue. So we image them after the mammogram has been read and the radiologists say, no, this mammogram is normal. They're offered the breast screening, they're offered the BRAID trial if they have BI-RADS C or D, and then they have a second round of imaging with the same modality. So basically the women are offered either whole breast ultrasound or contrast mammography or abbreviated MRI, and they're randomized into one of the arms. They can't choose, but they're randomized before they attend for screening. So if they have a negative mammogram and BI-RADS C or D breast tissue, and they want to participate in this trial and give us informed consent, then we will then offer them the supplemental imaging to which they've already been allocated. So the outcome measures in this study are cancer detection per 1,000 and the size of the cancers when they're detected by the supplemental imaging technique. And then we compare each modality. And then the secondary outcome measures are the biological characteristics of the cancers in each arm and the grade of the cancers. So this is the study design. So women, before they come to screening, are allocated into screening batches. They attend screening and they have their mammogram. The reader then reads the mammogram. If the mammogram is normal, both readers think the mammogram is normal, and their BI-RADS C or D, they are sent an invitation to join the study. They then contact the screening centres and they give either telephone consent or online consent, filling an online questionnaire. And then, as I said, they're already been pre-allocated to one of the arms, ultrasound or contrast mammography or abbreviated MRI, or they're in their standard of care. And what we were doing is we were hoping to get more than 2,000 people into each arm of the study, and then we repeat the imaging between a year and 18 months later. And again, we're hoping to get over 1,000 women in that second round of imaging. At the baseline, initially, when we started, and this was pre-COVID pandemic, we were asking them for a saliva sample so we could do SNPs, but we also get them to complete an online risk questionnaire so we can see whether they're at high risk or low risk of developing cancer. So the women have now had their first round of imaging and their second round of imaging, and then what happens is they then go back to routine screening at the 3-yearly interval. So where have we got to so far? So this is the UK map. There's 2 sites were in Scotland and the remaining sites were in England. And you can see the numbers here on the left-hand column. This was our final recruitment numbers, and we've recruited almost 9,000 women into the study. So we completed recruitment in March 2024. We've completed follow-up. We haven't yet completed follow-up. That will be in March next year, 2025. But we're hoping to publish our initial outcomes by December of this year. And obviously our aim is, if we show that the supplemental imaging does pick up additional cancers at a smaller size, that we then would hope that we might be able to introduce supplemental imaging to the UK screening programme. So I'm afraid I can't give you the results to this study, but other trials do show significant benefit when offering abbreviated MR or contrast mammography. There have been various trials in the States and Europe. Who should be offered, which women should be offered these additional imaging techniques? Certainly BI-RADS C or D, and that's what the recommendation is in the United States, that all women who are BI-RADS C and D should be offered supplemental imaging. But our problem in the UK is that 37% of our population are in that BI-RADS C and D category. So that's, we do 2.2 million a year, that's 740,000 women. So how do we choose who would benefit most? So when we look at the CanRisk questionnaire, we can see that this splits these women. So these are only the BI-RADS C and D women, so increased breast density. And you can see that actually you can split the women into two different groups. So if you take women who are designated into a high risk or very high risk, using the CanRisk questionnaire, this is the Bodicea risk model, asking about things like family history, when they had their menopause, when their menarche was, are they taking HRT, other known risk factors, then we see that about 47% of the population, well, it must be 48% of the population, fall into this high risk and very high risk. So it may be that we can take the C's and D's and then use a CanRisk questionnaire to split them into higher and low risk categories. So what we did was we then plotted out the cancers across the actual risks that we got from our participants from the CanRisk questionnaire. Now, probably you can't see this, but these little lines here are the actual cancers. And you can see falling off here, this is about the halfway point here, the 47, 48%. And you can see that there's a number of cancers in this group here. So when we looked at it and we said, okay, if we take a cutoff point of more than 2.3% 5-year risk, then in fact we got 47 cancers, so it's 43% of all the cancers, which is a rate of 22 per 1,000 cancers. So this would be very respectable. So it looks like we could refine our population. So this is the highest quartile. We just take the top 25% of the women in our study, they get 44% of the cancers. So rather than just using breast density as a means of selecting women who should have this additional supplemental imaging, we can use other factors to do this. Now, we had to stop using SNPs because of the pandemic. It was also too expensive, but probably SNPs could be used as well, these single nucleotide polymorphisms, because SNPs are particularly good for identifying those individuals who are in the low risk categories. So we could safely not offer them supplemental imaging. So what do I think? I think we can split women into increasing risk using SNPs and online questionnaires such as CanRisk, the Bodicea tool. I think what we can do is we can split women into different densities. There's various tools that we can do that. And my suggestion would be that the very low risk women get 5-yearly mammography. The people at population risk should get 2-yearly tomosynthesis. And if you're increasing risk and increasing density, maybe annual DBT. And then we should be reserving our supplemental imaging of contrast mammography, abbreviated MRI or whole breast ultrasound for the group that are at the highest risk and the highest breast density. And of course, we keep to our annual MRI for the BRCA carriers and those known to be at least 50% risk of developing breast cancer. So I think the future is bright, and I look forward to presenting the final results of the BRAID study. Thank you very much indeed.
Hello, my name's Dr. Sarah Savaridas. I'm a breast radiology based in Dundee in Scotland, and I would like to thank the organisers for inviting me to speak on the topic cost effectiveness of contrast enhanced mammography compared to MRI for local staging of breast cancer. These are my disclosures. And this is just a quick slide to touch on what exactly contrast enhanced mammography is. Essentially, it's a dual energy technique that uses contrast the same as is used in CT or angiography. And a low energy image is acquired, a high energy image is acquired, and from these a subtracted recombined image is generated. Now, we all know that there are lots of indications for contrast in mammography, and there's a huge amount of research and data that's coming out about those. But equally, in the UK, we are really suffering from a funding shortage. and backlogs. And if this is the closest I've ever seen to a money tree, on the left it's called the Golden Flower and it's at a museum in Malaysia. The tree on the other side is pretty much the state of our NHS just now. So what has this really got to do with Brazil? Well, I wanted to try and make this talk relevant, so I've looked at a comparison between the two different health services, and actually there are quite a lot of similarities. The UK does have more radiologists per population, and it does have more MRI scanners by quite a significant amount, although the UK, it has to be noted, has fewer MRI scanners than most of Europe. The amount of GDP that's spent on healthcare is similar, and also, really importantly, both healthcare systems offer free access to comprehensive healthcare. I also want to just touch on the differences with breast cancer. Now, the UK does have a much higher incidence, but the survival is also higher. And I suspect this is at least in part related to the age at diagnosis. Much more of our women are older women who tend to have more indolent cancers, and that can't be purely explained by the age. So why does this matter? Well, this is all relevant because to do a cost analysis, I'm quite a pragmatic radiologist and I want this to have an impact for clinical care. And when contrast mammography was first brought out, there was a nice paper, and this is what they wrote, that a clinical expert estimated the cost of contrast. But if you look, the problem is it doesn't take into account the software upgrade cost or the cost of a pump, or indeed if you need to replace equipment altogether. Now, if we're going to bring in contrast mammography into our services, and when we're at a state where our services don't really have any money, we have to prove beyond doubt that this is a money-saving or at least an economically sound argument. And that's the basis on which our calculation was done. Now, these are all the potential indications for contrast mammography, and they're all very good. And I'm sure that you will have had talks on many of them during this conference. But we concentrated on two, one being when it's used in diagnostic workup, and one when it's being used in local regional staging. The reason for this is very simple. It's the area where there's the most research, and there is unequivocal evidence that contrast mammography is comparable to MRI in accuracy. And this is important because if we can demonstrate that contrast mammography is less expensive than MRI, then that means that it's easier for us to be able to introduce it into a service. Now, this is an example of a case of local regional staging, and this is the plain mammogram. You can probably see in the left breast there's an ill-defined mass. What you can't see is that it's multifocal, and that was the same as on MRI. And it's just a nice example to show just how useful contrast mammography can be. And these are our national guidelines. Now, unlike a lot of Europe and America and other places in the world, we don't offer MRI upfront to most patients. It's a much more limited number of patients. And this document from some years ago now does state that contrast mammography has comparable accuracy, so it reflects the evidence. And these are the indications for when we use it. And I bring us back to the evidence, to what I mentioned before, my understanding of demographics of the women in Brazil that are getting breast cancer. And with a much younger demographic, I would suggest that you probably have at least as many, if not considerably more, women who would meet this criteria, because basically these are the criteria of women where conventional imaging is unlikely to show the true disease extent. So it's dense breasts, mammographically occult tumours, all of these cancers that are more common in younger women. So our calculation, we took what we would call a bottom-up approach. So essentially gathering all the data from everything that would go into reporting contrast mammography, right down to the cost of a machine if it was to be upgraded or replaced, the cost of contrast, the cost of the equipment to do it, the cost of someone to cannulate. Every single thing that went into being able to produce a contrast mammogram was considered. Now, again, this is why it was really important to define what the indication for contrast mammography we were using was, because if you take into account the cost of a mammogram machine, then the more you use it, the lower the cost of each imaging technique, because essentially you divide the cost of the machine by the number of studies you're going to do. So that was why we had to define it, and that's why we took staging as the technique we were going to use. And this is the reason why the cost that's generated by contrast mammography is quite varied, because we judged it to be around £40 if you only required an upgrade to the equipment, and also you had a large health board where you were going to be using that equipment for doing a large number of staging studies, local staging studies. Whereas on the flip side, if you're a small health board that's only going to use it for a few, and also you need a whole new machine, that's inevitably going to cost more. But even so, we demonstrated that you could save money by introducing it. Even if you had to buy a whole new machine, a whole new unit, and you weren't going to use it terribly frequently, there was still a fair chance you would save money compared to you doing local regional staging by MRI. But now this is really important to bear in mind, that in reality, the savings would be far greater. Because in reality, no one is going to use a mammo machine purely for contrast mammography and leave it idle all the time that you're not doing that. You'd use it for standard mammography in between. And also, in reality, even though diagnosis and local regional staging is by far the strongest evidence, there are other indications. And the likelihood is that once you have access to contrast mammography, you will use it for other indications. For example, in our health board, whilst this is the primary indication, we find it incredibly useful even following an MRI, because we don't have access to MRI guided biopsy. So we can use a contrast mammography to guide a stereo biopsy, for example. Or we can use it for women who, for whatever reason, can't have an MRI, be that they're claustrophobic, or they're unable to lie on their front for a prolonged period of time, or that they've had a reaction to gadolinium but they're okay with iodinated contrast. There's a number of reasons where actually a contrast mammogram could be performed when we're unable to perform an MRI. So there are definite limitations to the analysis that we performed. We didn't consider downstream costs, so we didn't take into account whether further imaging would be generated because of the contrast mammogram. So we see something else, we then have to do further images to characterize that, perhaps second look ultrasounds. We didn't take into account biopsies, but also we didn't take into account surgical outcomes. So does doing a contrast mammogram actually mean that you get the right surgical operation the first time round, so that you're not having to do repeated operations for involved margins, for example? We don't have recurrence data. So are we actually benefiting the patients but also the healthcare system by taking out the full cancer the first time round, so therefore reducing recurrence and the impact that that has? These are things that future research, it would be really, really important and useful to take into account. And the other thing that I mentioned previously is we didn't consider other indications that in reality it would be used for. Disease monitoring, for example, for patients undergoing neoadjuvant therapy, high-risk screening cases, surveillance following treatment for cancer, to name a few. The other thing is our research is based on UK cost data. So although it would be really nice, and I have to admit I was tempted to try and translate it into another currency, you can't do that, because you need to look at each individual unit. You need to look at the cost of radiology time, for example, the cost of contrast, the cost of the equipment, the upgrade, and that may vary, and it may vary in a different manner. Also, to do a comparative analysis with MRI, you need to look at the cost of MRI in your health service. So I would love to be able to say this could be directly applied to other countries, but sadly it can't. But I would hope that it is still nevertheless useful. Now, there have been other publications looking at the cost of contrast mammography, and this is a summary of them. The first is the NICE guidelines that I showed you at the beginning, and that was just expert opinion, and that was basically taking the cost of mammogram and the cost of some contrast and the cost of the line, and really that isn't enough of an analysis to be meaningful. Now, it's interesting to note that 2 of these papers were actually published by companies that have very much a vested interest. One is Hologic and the other is Bayer. So I would take that into consideration. Bayer did a budget impact analysis, but when you hone down to actually what the cost of the unit cost of contrast mammography, they just looked at what reimbursement costs were happening in the US at that time. Patel's paper is interesting. They attempted to look at the cost in screening, but again, actually, when you hone it down to the cost of contrast mammography specifically, they simply took their local policy, which was to add on consumables to the cost of a normal mammogram, similar to the NICE guidelines. Loeb simply took the cost of a bilateral diagnostic mammogram, as far as can be told, didn't appear to include contrast. The Blackenberg paper is published by, or at least sponsored by, Bayer. Interestingly, they found that the cost of CM was comparable to full protocol MRI in the incremental cost effectiveness ratio. But as I say, I would take that with a pinch of salt, as Bayer will have a vested interest in that. So of all of these, the most interesting is the Ali paper coming out of the US last year. And theirs, I think, is interesting. They looked at it as a time-based costing, and they looked at it in both screening and diagnostic, and they did take into account lots of different factors. And they estimate the cost of a screening contrast mammography at 120, whereas a diagnostic at 123. And I would assume that difference in costing is at least in part to do with the fact that a diagnostic study, you're more likely to have downstream costs with biopsies than screening, where the majority of patients will have a normal screen. So that leaves me to acknowledgements, and I must acknowledge Lily, who was the joint co-author of the paper in which I'm sharing. She is a senior lecturer in health economics and did all the complex analysis to come up with these figures. So full acknowledgement to her, and thank you very much for listening.
Excelentes palestras, fantásticas, parabenizar as professoras. E eu vou apresentar os nossos colegas que serão os debatedores dessa mesa, a doutora Vânia Ravizzini Manoel Sondermann. É assim, Vânia?
Isso.
Ela é especialista em imaginologia mamária e intervenção percutâneas, médica radiologista do Centro de Estudo e Pesquisa da Mulher, do CEPEM. Também estará conosco o professor Alexandre Marchiori, que é mastologista, presidente da Sociedade Brasileira de Mastologia da Regional Goiás e responsável pelo setor de imagem do CDI de Goiás, e o nosso grande amigo e mentor de imagem no Brasil, o professor José Luis Esteves, é mastologista, professor adjunto da Faculdade de Medicina de São José do Rio Preto, a FAMERP, e membro da Comissão Nacional de Mamografia como representante da FEBRASGO. Eu vou pedir para vocês fazerem perguntas bem objetivas, tá? Para que a gente consiga fazer algumas rodadas de perguntas para os professores e para que a gente consiga cumprir o nosso tempo. Pode começar, Vânia, por favor.
Primeiro, eu queria parabenizar as duas pelas brilhantes palestras. Eu sou entusiasta do método. Eu trabalho numa clínica que tem os dois métodos. A gente tem... cada vez que eu estudo a mamografia contrastada, eu fico mais encantada com os resultados, ainda mais porque a gente tem uma avaliação muito rápida da imagem. A minha pergunta fica a respeito daquelas lesões que são discretas, né? As lesões que captam, realçam contrastes muito discretas, como que elas lidam com isso, quais são as dicas que elas têm para a gente poder lidar com essa situação melhor, que eu acho que é o grande dificuldade para a gente. Fora que a gente tem o problema da saúde suplementar, que autoriza e paga a ressonância, mas não a tomossíntese e muito menos a mamografia com contraste. Então, eu, infelizmente, acho que esse é o grande problema que a gente tem na atualidade para poder ter disseminada essa tecnologia que realmente é muito interessante e tem resultados muito promissores.
Professora Fiona, professora Sara, alguma das duas gostaria de responder a pergunta?
So just hi, well, first of all,
Hi.
thank you so much for inviting us to speak at this meeting. I wish I was with you in Brazil. I'm in very cold and foggy Devon at the moment, and I won't show you that it's I'm sure you're having much better weather there. So anyway, the question is, I was listening to it on translation, so I may have got it wrong. The question is, what do we do with small lesions that we find on contrast mammo? Is that correct?
Is that with the mild?
Eu acho que ela está com a
Only
tradução.
a small amount of enhancement.
Yes, mild
Okay.
enhancement.
Mild enhancement. So you're absolutely right. One of the difficulties, so people show, and Sarah was showing beautiful images with contrast mammography and things. When people are showing the technique contrast mammography, they show, a very dense breast, and then they show the contrast mammogram, and there's some bright area that enhances, and that's the cancer, or maybe it's a fibroadenoma. But, they show these obvious lesions, and you think, yeah, fantastic technique. But we've certainly had experience, and I think probably Sarah will be the same, whereby you see, sometimes you have a known cancer and you're doing the contrast examination to maybe stage the breast to see if there's additional disease, and you get just actually not that much enhancement. And, you're kind of thinking, have I done something wrong? Did they get the full dose of contrast? What was there a problem with the technique? And you just don't get that much enhancement. And it certainly happens with cancers that we've known about. But this makes me anxious when I'm using the technique, that what else am I missing when I only get a low level of enhancement? And I think that the important thing, I think there is actually quite a big learning curve, as with any new technique. You think it's going to be easy, but actually it's not that easy. And so we ended up in the BRAID study having quite a high recall rate from contrast mammography for this very problem. Some of the lesions weren't particularly high enhancement rate, or didn't have particularly high enhancement, but we were worried that they could be a cancer, or we saw additional things on the image that we just weren't sure about. And so I think the thing that's going to help us in the future is paying good attention to technique, looking at the dose to see, were they getting the full dose? Were they just getting a standard 100 ml and it was just a very large patient or something? Should you be using the 1.5 ml per kilogram at 350 iodine dose? I think the literature's not, Sarah will probably know the literature better than me on this, but I think we need to pay attention to the technique. And I think the other thing that might help us is if we can ask the manufacturers to help us with, some of their processing software for mammograms gives us great edge enhancement, or they kind of have very clever tools that they bring out lesions and make them more conspicuous for us. And it maybe we need to do something around contrast mammography, that we need to work with the manufacturers about how we make these lesions more conspicuous. And then the other thing is, of course, AI. Can AI actually help us in this area as well? Sorry, a very long garbled answer in English, not in Portuguese. So sorry about this. Sarah, have you got other things to add?
Mainly, I'd reiterate what you said. I'd just like to say, I bet your weather in Devon's better than what it is in Scotland right now. You've still got daylight. Just a couple of things. I think what you're saying about it being a learning curve is very true. I would say if you're thinking about bringing this in, I would start with sort of the easy cases. So if you start with cases where there's a known cancer and you're staging or there's a high suspicion, that's easier than starting with screening cases. Certainly we found braid a lot more challenging than our local staging because you're looking for very subtle things that you haven't seen by definition on a standard mammogram, so it is harder. The usual rules apply. Compare with the other side. I would say even if you're only worried about one side, always do a bilateral, because it's really important to compare, and asymmetries will help guide you. In our experience, the background enhancement tends not to be as bad as the equivalent that you get on MRI, but it absolutely does happen. And I think sometimes we just have to be open and honest with that and tell our surgical colleagues, there's a lot of background enhancement. I can only tell you as much as I can see within that context. And we just have to accept that nothing's perfect, but I think it is important for us to tell them that. From a technique point of view, the one thing that I would say that we have found helpful is we often do a delayed image. So if there's one side we're more concerned about, we may start by imaging that breast, then do the other breast, and then go back to the index breast to do one delayed MLO. And that can be helpful. If you've got something that's enhancing just a bit more slowly, it'll stand out. And equally, it can be reassuring if it just increases with all the background. So that can be quite helpful, we've found. But yes, I would agree. I don't think there is any, I don't think there's a quick fix or a really easy answer. I think those lesions, the ones that are very subtle, are very difficult, unfortunately.
Thank you.
Excelente, né? Um método extremamente promissor, mas você vê duas grandes especialistas na área, com uma experiência muito grande na mamografia contrastada, falando aí das dificuldades que nós temos para aprender a ler esse método, já que é um método novo. Alexandre, fica à vontade, pode fazer seus questionamentos.
Olá, primeiramente agradecer aí a lembrança, grande amigo Henrique, e é uma honra estar aqui entre amigos e com experts aí que nos prestigiam e nos ensinam muito aí, né? A princípio, eu gostaria de fazer uma reflexão aqui e entender como é que a doutora Fiona nos contou que o rastreamento no Reino Unido funciona a cada 3 anos, e recentemente a gente teve um desconforto aqui, logo no final do Outubro Rosa, nós batendo na tecla de que mamografia anual é muito mais eficiente, é o que salva mais vidas. Nossa sociedade se incomodou muito com o posicionamento do Ministério da Saúde, de um grande instituto nacional que a gente tem aqui, que dá muitos dados a respeito de câncer, e isso deixa nossa sociedade desconfortável. Como as sociedades na Europa, no Reino Unido, lidam com essa indicação, que a gente sabe que não é a ideal, no rastreamento, que a gente vai estar perdendo casos novos de câncer de mama e prejudicando a possibilidade, aumentando o número de câncer de intervalo, como a senhora nos mostrou, e as sociedades aí ficam desconfortáveis também, como nós ficamos, doutora Fiona?
So I think the question is about whether the pressure that you're getting to be doing annual mammography, is that correct?
Nós gostaríamos de realizar mamografias anuais, mas o Ministério da Saúde preconiza a cada 2 anos aqui no Brasil, após os 50 anos. E, pelo que a senhora nos disse, a cada 3 anos aí no Reino Unido, após os 50. Mamografias antes do...
Yeah. So that's right. In the UK, We do mammography every 3 years. We're the only country in the world to do them at this low frequency. And I have to say, as I was showing you on that table, it means that we have a large number of interval cancers, the cancers that occur between the screens, because we're only doing it every 3 years. Now, in Europe, generally, in fact, virtually all the countries are doing it 2 yearly in Europe. And the reason that so from the public health doctor's perspective, they weigh up what is the yield of cancers that you get with doing 2 yearly mammography. What's the cost to the country of doing mammography every 2 years? And then how many cancers, and then how many years of life saved do they get from picking up those cancers early by offering 3 yearly mammography? So they calculate the cost benefit in the system. And often these cost benefit models for each country are based on your own population data, the Brazilian population data, and looking to see what age is the cancer, what's the peak incidence of cancer, what's the current staging information, what's the survival from cancer, what are the treatments like at the different stages. And so the economists seem to develop these complex models and say, yeah, we're going to, so in the UK, for example, we say that if a test or a treatment will be offered to an individual, anyone in the UK, if it costs less than £20,000 for that individual to get additional year of life. So, for example, if somebody needed a hip replacement, then as long as giving the hip replacement cost on a population basis under £20,000 for each additional year, that person will get a good quality life by having a new hip. And so that's how in the UK, that's how we calculate a health care intervention. And public health doctors look at the whole of health, the whole of a population, what the needs of that particular population are. And that's why they make quite different judgments, or it feels like they make quite different judgments to what we would want them to make when we're working in a particular specialty. Because we know what the latest things are. We want them to say, oh, but you should be adopting MRI, you should be adopting abbreviated MRI, we should be doing supplemental imaging, we should be doing that. And until we actually demonstrate a justifiable cost benefit, offering a new thing on the population basis, it's very difficult for our policymakers to get the government to pay for a change in what we're offering. Does that answer the question? I'm not sure if it does answer your question or not.
The other thing that might be worth just mentioning is that that's our, I mean, I would agree with Fiona, and I think it would be fair to say that amongst radiologists, most of us would be more comfortable if we did 2 yearly than 3 yearly, but it's just not something that we're ever going to have control over. I think once you start to go annual, as Fiona alluded to, your risk of sort of overdiagnosis starts to go up. But one thing that we should just say in the UK is that there are certain groups where there's a very strong family history that we have. So we have population screening, which Fiona's explained in detail, but we do also have women who are considered to be at moderate, high or very high risk. And then there are 3 separate additional streams of screening where the women will get more frequent screening from a younger age, and for the very high risk, so your BRCA equivalent or BRCA patients will get annual MRI. But yes, I think it boils down to money, sadly. There isn't enough to go around, and I think that is the bottom line. One thing, and I know Fiona's done a lot of work at looking at this, is it may be possible to reduce the amount of screening the women at the very, very low risk require. And if we were able to do that, that would potentially free up a little bit more for those the other women to have a sort of, but then you start to get into the realms of personalized screening. But I think that may be, from the UK perspective, the only way I can see that we're going to be able to do it more frequently is if we do it less frequently in a different group, realistically, because I don't think someone's going to find more money, unfortunately.
Perfeito, excelente, né? Debate. Eu acho que a gente passaria o resto do dia conversando com essas duas experts. Que gostoso que é aproveitar da experiência delas. O Brasil é um país que tem em torno de 30 a 40% dos casos de câncer de mama em estadio 3 ou 4, né? E nós temos uma porcentagem muito alta de pacientes jovens com câncer de mama, pacientes abaixo de 50 anos com câncer de mama. Então, as sociedades médicas aqui, elas se incomodam muito com o fato do rastreamento copiar o modelo europeu e o modelo canadense, e a gente precisa estudar mais para saber o que acontece na nossa população e se adequar aqui. Professor José Luis, você tem 5 minutos aí, José Luis, para aproveitar o conhecimento das nossas queridas professoras. Então, é com você a palavra, José.
Bom dia a todos. Obrigado, Henrique, e à comissão organizadora pelo convite, e aos amigos aí que estão, e a parabenizar a doutora Fiona, a doutora Sala, pelas aulas e principalmente pelas respostas, né? Essas respostas que a gente procura. Qual o exame melhor, qual é a técnica melhor para detectar mais câncer de mama? É o que todo mundo procura, né? Quando fazer, quando não fazer, é o que todo mundo procura, né? Quando você tem limites, né, que a vida impõe a todos os países, né, em termos de financeiros principalmente. E uma coisa que eu achei muito interessante que a doutora falou, doutora Fiona, do underdiagnose, né, o subdiagnóstico. Esse realmente é mais importante do que o overdiagnose, né? Você tem uma lesão, você tem que saber o que é a lesão. Você procurou, quis procurar, agora você tem que dar o diagnóstico para a paciente. Mas perder uma lesão, principalmente nas mulheres que sabidamente a gente sabe que elas têm um risco maior, né? As mutadas, as que têm mamas densas, né? As que têm uma história familiar mais rica em câncer, principalmente câncer de mama, essas nós temos que tratar diferencialmente, né? Eu acho que, como a doutora falou, a mamografia é o que baliza, né? E depois a gente vê essa mama é densa, essa mama nos preocupa, onde pode ter um tumor a mais, né? E eu queria saber da doutora Fiona, da doutora Sara, se no momento que se estabelece que aquela paciente tem uma mama de alto risco, ela, além de ser uma paciente de alto risco, ela pode ter a mama de alto risco, né? Se a mamografia ainda se manterá no segmento ou vai ser substituída no futuro aí, não sabemos quando, por só fazer ressonância ou intercalar com contrastada, né? Acho que é isso que o Braide está procurando entender, mas acho que essa é uma busca. Quero saber se vocês visualizam isso também, da gente deixar a mamografia realmente para o pessoal mais com baixo risco e as mamas de alto risco, a gente ter uma coisa mais específica para tentar perder menos tumores nessas pacientes.
Yeah, I think that's a really good question that you're asking. So I think that I think the other thing that we haven't really considered are these AI tools which can read a mammogram and can predict the short-term risk. So there's been some very nice publications about the Murray tool from Adam Yala's group in America. And then there was an excellent paper from Frederick Strand's group, the Screen Trust MRI trial, where they used this 3 different algorithms, and he used them together to try and select women with a normal mammogram from the population and offered them the MRI screening. And in that group, he found 64 cancers per 1,000. So I mean, I think for me, this is one of these, like, this is a real game changer. I mean, I was already sold on supplemental imaging, but I just didn't quite know how we were going to select the population in a way, as Sarah's pointing out, within the budget, the big envelope, the amount of money that we're given for offering screening in the UK for all these women. It's it's over 2 million women a year that we screen, and so these predictive AI tools, I think, really look really promising, and I think we should be looking at those and say, Could that help us choose? So, for example, a woman might come and have her risk assessed at whatever age, maybe 40, depending on where your increasing prevalence of cancer is in your population. So she would have some kind of risk, maybe with the SNPs, you know, the little bits of genetic material. She would have some kind of risk questionnaire filled out online. And from that, you would say, yeah, she's at, as Sarah was saying, she falls into this very high risk category, the high risk category, or a medium risk category, or she's at population risk. And then you could do some kind of imaging. And from the mammogram point of view, you could then use this short-term risk tool, the predictive AI tools, to then say, actually, this lady, despite the fact the X-ray looks normal to the radiologists, the tool is saying she's at high risk, despite the fact that her other risk factors, her genetics, etc., put her at the population risk. And then you would say, okay, the mammogram looks normal, but she needs a supplemental imaging test. Or if she's not a particularly high density, she maybe needs another mammogram in a year's time. Now, I know that in the UK, the policymakers are going to just go, oh, that's far too complicated. But you know what? I think we need to be respectful of the disease and the population in whom the disease is occurring, and say, yeah, it's quite complicated, actually. It is quite complex. If it was easy, we'd have solved it, but we haven't. We've got this underdiagnosis problem. So I think we need to persuade our policymakers in all the different countries to look more carefully at the tools that we've got at our disposal and say, yes, as Sarah's suggesting, let's put them into the different risk categories to start. You decide, depending on your own peak rates or how early cancer, you know, what the early onset is in Brazil. Decide then when you might do that initial evaluation, and then offer some kind of screening at whatever age, and then use the tools like the, you know, Murray or you know, the Screen Trust AI tool or whatever, to say actually she needs either a supplemental imaging test, or actually, you know what, she's at very low risk of getting a cancer in the next 3 to 5 years, mammogram in 5 years' time, you know, or imaging more frequently.
I just want to add a couple of much more simple and basic.
Sorry.
It's okay. I think the first thing is, I think I hear what you're saying about the fact that we take the findings from one population and just try and transplant it on another, and that trying to apply what we do in, say, Europe to Brazil directly is probably not necessarily wise, because it's not the same population. I think that's very true. I'm personally slightly concerned / suspicious that what we do in the UK is based on what works for white European women and possibly isn't representative of our actual population. We know that the minority ethnic groups and all our underserved populations don't do as well. It's much harder to get those groups to be engaged in research as well, so they're unlikely to be. So that's a big concern to me. And I also think that on a simple level, in our screening program isn't perfect. 3 yearly isn't perfect. I don't think either of us would say it was. But actually, if we could even get all of our population to come 3 yearly, we would probably save a lot of lives, because we don't have a, you know, even getting that uptake. So I think it's really important to look at these all the technology and try and advance that, but I think we mustn't lose sight of the simple things of actually making sure we actually represent all our communities, and that we're actually serving everyone with the sort of the simple things as well, because at the moment there's groups of women who aren't even coming for a straightforward mammogram, so we mustn't lose sight of that. But yeah, and I think if you could get evidence for what screening works for your population, I would be very interested, excited to hear it, because I think that there's parts of our population that maybe would benefit from having that as well, because I think that, yeah, a lot of our research is based on one demographic that doesn't represent everyone in the UK.
Yeah, very important point. Yeah, so Brazil, we need you to be leading the way.
Sim. Gente, muitíssimo obrigado, professora Fiona, professora Sara, por compartilhar o conhecimento de vocês com a gente. Vocês falam algumas coisas aí que pelo menos a minha cabeça, abre muito sobre perspectivas do que a gente pode fazer aqui no Brasil. Obrigado, Vânia, obrigado, Zé, obrigado, Alexandre, né? A gente vai ter que encerrar a mesa, que o nosso tempo já estourou aqui, mas muitíssimo obrigado, foi uma mesa maravilhosa.